The men who drew these maps were not ignorant. They were not superstitious fools inventing monsters to fill the spaces they hadn't explored. They were sailors, men who had watched their friends disappear beneath waves that came from nowhere, who had seen things in open water that no chart could explain. When they wrote, "Here be dragons on the edges of the known world," they were not being poetic. They were passing on a warning. Every civilization that ever put a boat in the water developed its own vocabulary of terror. The Norse called it the Kraken. The ancient Greeks called it Charybdis. The Caribbean pirates had a dozen names for the things they saw, most of which never made it into any official record because the men who saw them didn't survive long enough to file a report. But here is the thing the legends always leave out. The truth, when you find it, is frequently more terrifying than the story told around it. Because the sailors who came home didn't invent the monsters from nothing. They were describing something real, filtered through the only language they had for experiences that had no precedent. The Kraken was real. The ghost ships were real. The sea serpents, in the specific and limited way that truth survives in the mouths of terrified men, were real. And the stories built around those real things grew until the original event was almost invisible underneath everything added to it. These are 5 of the most terrifying legends the sea has ever produced. And behind each one is a truth the legend was trying, in its own distorted way, to tell. In 1752, a Danish bishop named Erik Pontoppidan published a book called The Natural History of Norway. He described the Kraken as a floating island, a mass so large that sailors had mistaken it for land, dropped anchor on it, lit fires, cooked meals, and only realized their mistake when the island began to sink beneath them. He described tentacles the size of ships' masts, eyes like millstones, a body so enormous that its wake, when it descended, created a whirlpool capable of pulling entire vessels down with it. Pontoppidan was not a credulous man. He interviewed fishermen carefully, cross-referenced accounts, and concluded that something real was being described, something that existed in the deep water off the Norwegian coast, something that defied any category he had available. The fishermen said the Kraken rose from the deep in summer, appearing near the surface where the fish were most concentrated. Wherever the Kraken appeared, the fishing was extraordinary. Its body rising from below drove fish to the surface in enormous numbers. The fishermen of Norway both feared the Kraken and depended on it. Its presence meant a good catch. Its sudden disappearance beneath the surface meant something worse was coming. For 100 years after Pontoppidan, the Kraken lived in that uncertain space between legend and natural history. Then, in 1854, a Danish natural historian named Japetus Steenstrup stood before the Scientific Society of Copenhagen and presented something recovered from a whale's stomach. A hooked beak made of a material harder than bone and roughly the size of a man's fist. Steenstrup argued it belonged to a squid of a size no one had previously documented. He named the hypothetical animal Architeuthis dux, the giant squid. In 1878, 2 Canadian fishermen off the coast of Newfoundland found a carcass that had washed ashore near Thimble Tickle. They measured it before cutting it up for dog food, because that is what practical men do. The body alone was 20 feet long. The tentacles extended an additional 35 feet. Total length, 55 feet. The natural world had confirmed, in broad outline, what Norwegian fishermen had been saying for centuries. There was something in the deep water, something enormous, something with tentacles. But the giant squid doesn't fully account for the Kraken legend. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. Largest confirmed specimen measures around 45 feet. Impressive, but not capable of sinking ships, not capable of being mistaken for an island. The colossal squid, Mesonychoteuthis hamiltoni, was first properly described from a complete specimen in 2007. It lives at depths between 1,000 and 2,000 meters. It has the largest eyes of any animal on Earth, each one the size of a dinner plate. Its tentacles are lined not with suckers, but with rotating hooks. A complete specimen caught in the Ross Sea weighed over 1,000 pounds. No complete adult has ever been recovered. The animal lives at depths humans have barely explored, in water so cold and dark that even sending instruments down there is an act of significant engineering. The deep sea floor covers more of the Earth's surface than all the continents combined. Less than 20% has been mapped with any precision. Less than 5% has been directly observed. The Norwegian fishermen who described the Kraken were describing encounters with the edges of a world that science is still, 3 centuries later, only beginning to understand. The legend was right about the essential fact: there is something very large down there, we just don't know how large. The Flying Dutchman appears in the written record for the first time in 1790. The entry records a conversation with a sailor who claimed to have sighted the Dutchman off the Cape of Good Hope, a ghost ship that sailed perpetually without crew, condemned to those waters until Judgment Day. The sailor described a vessel that appeared in storms, visible through the rain and spray, that disappeared when you tried to approach it, and whose sighting was an omen of disaster. By 1800, the Flying Dutchman was the most widely known maritime ghost story in the Atlantic world. Every sailor who rounded the Cape had a story, or knew someone who had one. The details varied, but the core was consistent: a ship that sailed without living crew, a captain condemned forever as punishment for some terrible sin. The legend crystallized around a specific name in the early 19th century. Hendrik van der Decken, a Dutch captain who had sworn a blasphemous oath to round the Cape against contrary winds. His ship appeared to mariners as a warning, and some versions held that if you accepted a letter from the Flying Dutchman to carry to port, you yourself would be cursed. The Dutch East India Company ran its ships past the Cape continuously from the late 16th century onward. The Cape was the critical choke point on the route to the Spice Islands, and it killed ships with a consistency that no navigational skill could entirely prevent. The Southern Ocean wraps around the bottom of the world below South Africa. The winds blow without interruption at gale force. The waves build across thousands of miles of unobstructed ocean before hitting the Cape with their full accumulated force. Storms appear with very little warning. Ships vanished at the Cape regularly. A vessel that left Batavia with a full cargo of spices and 200 men would simply cease to exist somewhere in the Southern Ocean, with no record and no explanation beyond the obvious one. The sea had taken it. There is a well-documented phenomenon called Fata Morgana, a specific type of superior mirage that occurs in cold, dense air near the Cape. Fata Morgana transforms distant objects into elevated, distorted images that appear above the waterline and move in ways that don't correspond to solid objects. A ship actually below the horizon can appear reflected in the sky as a ghostly elevated image, sometimes inverted, sometimes multiple layered, always slightly wrong. Sailors rounding the Cape didn't have the meteorological vocabulary to identify what they were seeing. What they had was accumulated maritime lore that told them a ship seen in the wrong place, moving in the wrong way, appearing and disappearing without explanation, was a ghost. The Fata Morgana reflects real ships that are actually there, over the horizon, that you wouldn't otherwise see. The Flying Dutchman was always a real ship. You just couldn't get to it. But the Fata Morgana doesn't explain the most famous sighting in the historical record, which came not from an anonymous sailor in a tavern, but from a future King of England. On July 11, 1881, the royal training vessel HMS Bacchante was sailing off the Australian coast when several crew members reported seeing the Flying Dutchman. One of them was Prince George, the future King George V. He was 16 years old. He described a luminous vessel appearing in the early morning watch, glowing with a red light. 13 men aboard the Bacchante saw it. The lookout who first spotted it fell from the rigging and was killed later that same day. The bioluminescence of the Southern Ocean is genuine and documented. Certain conditions produce a surface glow that can light a ship from below, making it appear to emit its own light. Combined with a Fata Morgana distortion and the power of a story every sailor already knew, The conditions were sufficient to transform an explainable event into an encounter with the supernatural. The legend was grown from the specific, repeated, and genuinely terrifying experience of sailing past one of the most dangerous stretches of water on Earth, in conditions where the sea killed ships regularly, and the mind reached for any explanation that gave the death a name. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the pirate code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew, but it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds. Grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. The Flying Dutchman is the Cape of Good Hope, given a human face. The story of a man who would not yield to the sea, and whom the sea therefore kept forever. On August 6, 1848, the crew of HMS Daedalus reported seeing a sea serpent approximately 60 miles south-southwest of the Cape of Good Hope. Captain M. Kuhai filed an official report with the Admiralty when the Daedalus reached Plymouth. The report described a creature at least 60 feet in length, with a serpentine body and a head held approximately 4 feet above the water surface. It moved without visible undulation. It passed the ship at a distance of about 200 yards. The encounter lasted roughly 20 minutes. Richard Owen, the most prominent British natural historian of the era, publicly suggested the crew had seen a large seal. This produced a sharp letter from Captain Mikuhai, who pointed out that he had spent his entire career at sea and was familiar with large seals, and that what his officers had observed for 20 minutes at 200 yards was not a seal. Between 1817 and 1819, an extraordinary series of sightings occurred in Gloucester Harbor, Massachusetts. Over 2 years, hundreds of people reported seeing a large serpentine creature offshore. The witnesses were merchants, lawyers, ship captains, a harbor master. The Linnean Society of New England sent investigators and collected sworn depositions from more than 20 witnesses. The descriptions were consistent enough that investigators concluded something real had been seen. Multiple witnesses described it as 60 to 100 feet long, moving in vertical undulations, with a head similar to a horse or a turtle. One witness claimed to have fired a gun at it from close range with no visible effect. The candidates proposed by science include oarfish, a strange deep-sea creature that can reach lengths of over 50 feet, with an elongated ribbon-like form that could, in the right light, look serpentine. They are known to appear near the surface when dying or disoriented, but the oarfish doesn't fully account for the Gloucester sightings, where witnesses consistently described vertical undulations rather than the horizontal motion of an oarfish. Then there is the possibility that witnesses were seeing something science had not yet documented. The giant squid was a myth until 1854. The colossal squid was a myth until 1925. The megamouth shark was unknown to science until a specimen was accidentally caught in 1976. The ocean's catalog of creatures is genuinely incomplete. The sea serpent tradition spans every maritime culture on Earth. No culture that has lived near the sea has failed to develop a vocabulary for large, frightening things in the water. The consistency is itself a form of data. It doesn't prove sea serpents exist, but it strongly suggests sailors around the world over thousands of years were repeatedly encountering something they couldn't explain with the creatures they already knew. The science says oarfish, basking sharks, misidentified species. The sailors who gave sworn depositions to the Linnean Society say they were there for 20 minutes at close range and they know what they saw. That gap is where the legend lives. Every sailor who went to sea before the age of radio and weather satellites understood that the ocean was the place where men went to disappear. The sea took people, and it did not return them, and it offered no explanation for what it had taken. It kept its dead, absolutely. Davy Jones first appears in print in 1726 in a novel by Daniel Defoe. A character uses the phrase Davy Jones' locker to describe the bottom of the sea, apparently assuming the reader will understand without explanation. The casualness suggests the phrase was already in common use. Who was Davy Jones? The historical record provides no satisfying answer. One theory suggests a connection to Saint David, patron saint of whales. Another proposes a corruption of the biblical Jonah, the locker being the whale's belly. A third proposes a real man, a 16th century tavern keeper who kept a locked room where he press-ganged sailors into involuntary naval service. When men went to Davy Jones's locker, they disappeared into something from which there was no return. Davy Jones's locker was where things went when the sea took them. The chest at the bottom of the ocean where all the unclaimed souls were kept. A name for the final destination of men who died at sea and whose bodies were never recovered, which in the age of sail was the majority of men who died at sea. The cargo that went down with ships was not simply cargo. It was the accumulated wealth of nations. The 1715 hurricane destroyed 11 of 12 Spanish treasure vessels in a single night off the Florida coast, depositing the equivalent of several years of colonial revenue onto the ocean floor. Those ships are still there. The coins from the 1715 fleet still wash up on Florida beaches after storms. The silver bars from the Atocha are scattered across the floor of the Caribbean. Davy Jones's locker is not a metaphor. It is a description of an actual place where the wealth of centuries sits in the dark exactly where the sea put it. The terror embedded in the legend is not simply the terror of death. It is the terror of disappearance, of a vast underwater darkness that holds everything the surface world lost, intact and inaccessible and permanent. The Bermuda Triangle entered popular consciousness in 1964 when a writer named Vincent Gaddis coined the phrase in an article for Argosy magazine. He described a roughly triangular region of the North Atlantic with its points at Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, where ships and aircraft had been disappearing at an anomalous rate. The implication was clear. Something in the triangle was eating ships. By 1974, the Bermuda Triangle was the subject of a best-selling book by Charles Berlitz that proposed explanations ranging from magnetic anomalies to the lost city of Atlantis to extraterrestrial intervention. It was also, as subsequent investigators discovered, extensively inaccurate. Lawrence David Kusha spent several years going through the actual records behind every loss cited in the Bermuda Triangle literature. His book, published in 1975, was titled The Bermuda Triangle Mystery, Solved. Many of the ships and aircraft cited as triangle losses had not disappeared in the triangle at all. Some had gone down in the Pacific, some in the North Sea. Some had not disappeared at all and were still in service when writers claimed they had vanished mysteriously. The most famous triangle disappearance, Flight 19, 5 Navy Avenger torpedo bombers that vanished on December 5, 1945, was cited in virtually every triangle book as evidence of anomalous forces. The actual record tells a different story. Flight 19 launched into weather that deteriorated significantly. Lieutenant Charles Taylor became convinced he was somewhere he wasn't and continued flying northeast when his actual position required him to fly west. The aircraft ran out of fuel over open ocean after dark and went down. A rescue aircraft sent to search for them exploded in midair shortly after takeoff, probably due to a fuel leak. 14 men died. They had nothing to do with any triangle anomaly. The Lloyd's of London insurance market does not have a Bermuda Triangle category. It does not charge elevated premiums for vessels transiting the triangle. The U.S. Coast Guard has consistently stated that the rate of shipping losses in the triangle is not statistically different from any other heavily trafficked ocean region of comparable size. And yet the region is genuinely dangerous, not because of anomalous forces, but because of entirely normal ones operating with unusual intensity. The Bermuda Triangle sits directly in the path of the Gulf Stream, a current moving northward at speeds of up to 5 miles per hour that quickly disperses the wreckage of a sunken vessel. A ship that sinks in the triangle leaves a debris field the current scatters across hundreds of miles within days. The weather is also genuinely volatile. The western Atlantic produces sudden waterspouts capable of destroying a small vessel in minutes. Microbursts can generate winds over 100 miles per hour in a radius of less than a mile, creating seas that overwhelm a ship before any distress signal can be sent. The Bermuda Triangle is the only legend on this list largely invented after the fact, rather than grown organically from the accumulated experience of sailors. The other 4 were built by men trying to describe something they had actually experienced. The Bermuda Triangle was built by writers selecting data to support a narrative already constructed. The data was real. The losses were real. The pattern they were used to illustrate was not. What the mapmakers who wrote "Here Be Dragons" understood is that the ocean has always been larger than our understanding of it. The Kraken was a description of something real, filtered through the terror of men who had no framework for what they were seeing. The Flying Dutchman was a name given to the despair of watching ships disappear at the Cape year after year. The sea serpent was the honest testimony of witnesses who saw something that didn't fit their existing catalog. Davy Jones's locker was the only truthful thing anyone could say about where the dead of the sea actually went. And the Bermuda Triangle was the attempt of a modern world that had decided the ocean was conquered to grapple with the persistent evidence that it was not. The legends were never really about monsters. They were about the limits of human knowledge in the face of something that had no such limits. They were the way that practical men with practical problems gave shape and name to a darkness that had no shape or name. The ocean is still out there. The depths are still unmapped. The colossal squid still hunts in water too dark and cold for cameras. The wrecks still lie where they fell, untouched. The Gulf Stream still scatters evidence across miles of ocean. The Fata Morgana still appears in cold air over open water, showing sailors ships that are real but impossible to reach. The map said, "Here be dragons." It was not wrong. It was just describing something that no single word could fully contain. Something that went down 60 feet below the surface of a Norwegian fjord and left behind a school of fish so thick the fishermen could walk on it. Something that glowed red in the early morning watch off the Australian coast and then was simply gone. Something that passed a Royal Navy vessel at 200 yards for 20 minutes and left 20 credible witnesses who all told the same story. Here be dragons. They are still here. We have simply given them different names.